Among thousands of brittle plantation ledgers stored in forgotten county archives across rural Georgia, one book is always pulled out with hesitation. Local historians don't argue about its authenticity. They argue about whether it should have been made public at all. On a yellow page dated March 1851, a single entry describes a woman in words that still unsettle anyone who reads them. Female slave. Appearance considered abominable. Unfit for regular assignment. Expected value uncertain. Yet within 7 years of that entry, this same woman would own the estate whose books condemned her, control its fortune, and bury its master under circumstances so incendiary that state officials sealed the investigation. For over a century, what happened at Wikliffe Plantation was not just a story of forbidden desire or scandalous crossing of race and class. It was something colder, sharper, an experiment in power, law, and ambition carried out in the shadow of a system built on human bondage. Before we walk through those iron gates together, remember where you are. You're watching Liturgy of Fear, where we unearth the stories history tried to misfile, bury, or burn. If you're ready to hear what really happened at one of Georgia's most respectable plantations, make sure you're subscribed, hit the notification bell, and tell us in the comments which state you're watching from. Now, let's go back to when Wikliffe was still just another profitable monument to a dying world by the late 1840s. Wikliffe Plantation in Hancock County, Georgia, was considered a model of Southern efficiency. 1,200 acres of prime cotton land rolled away from the main house in neat, controlled lines. On paper, the estate averaged 320 bales a season, a quiet boast that traveled with the family's name from Sparta's dusty storefronts to Savannah's parlors. The main house itself was a textbook display of Greek Revival arrogance. 6 fluted columns, a wide wraparound veranda, and a quarter-mile oak-lined drive. That announced power long before visitors reached the steps. The man at the center of it all was Thaddeus Hafford. He'd inherited Wikliffe in 1842, along with 63 enslaved people and a tangle of debts that would have ruined a less disciplined man. At 31, recently widowed, his wife, Catherine, and their infant son dead in childbirth, Thaddeus had turned grief into obsession. His reputation in Hancock County was simple and chilling. He drank rarely. He socialized only when required. And he wrote everything down. Births, deaths, cotton yields, shoe repairs, candle purchases, every transaction. Passed through his ink-black handwriting into a series of leather-bound ledgers he refused to let anyone else touch. The overseer might manage the fields. The housekeeper might manage the rooms. But the numbers belonged to him. The enslaved workforce at Wikliffe lived in 2 rows of log cabins, whitewashed once a year to give the illusion of care. Thin cotton curtains divided families. The bell rang at 4:30 a.m., 6 days a week. Sundays were rest, forced church attendance and sermons about obedience, patience, and heavenly rewards that never seemed to arrive. Society in Hancock County was small but viciously structured. Maybe 24 planter families, a cluster of merchants in Sparta, and a floating population of overseers and traders who drifted from estate to estate like vultures following the smell of money. Plantation wives fought their quiet wars through tea invitations, harvest balls, and church seating. One detail bothered them all, though they rarely said it aloud. Wikliffe had no mistress. Thaddeus refused to remarry. His sister Margaret offered more than once to leave Savannah and act as hostess. He declined every time. In her place, he hired a free woman of color, Delapute, to run the domestic staff, a decision that was tolerated only because Wickliffe profits kept rising. This carefully balanced, rigid world began to tilt on a rain-swollen October afternoon, 1849. The slave coffle arrived late. Heavy rains had swollen the Oconee River, forcing a long detour. By the time Augustus Webb, a trader with a reputation for good Virginia stock, pulled into Wickliffe's side yard, the people in his charge had walked more than 200 miles in chains. 17 figures stumbled down from the wagons. Mud stiffened on their clothes, shackles rubbing raw grooves into their ankles and wrists. Their faces carried the familiar empty exhaustion of people who knew that wherever they were going, it would not be better. The inspection took place away from the main house, as custom demanded. Webb wanted to sell field hands, not disturb the white facade of comfort with the reality that kept it standing. Ledger in hand, Thaddeus walked down the line like a man choosing tools. Approximate age, visible health, teeth, scars. Temperament. He'd watched too many planters ruin themselves by trusting traders' promises. He bought only what he believed he could quantify. He almost missed her. She stood near the end of the line, head bowed, angled slightly away as if trying to fold herself out of sight. Early 20s, he guessed. 5'6". Strong shoulders built for field work. Filthy dress, like the others. Nothing unusual until he noticed the way she held herself. Not broken. Not exactly defiant, tight, controlled, like someone who had learned the cost of letting her. Real thoughts show. That one's not for sale, Webb said quickly, following Thaddeus's gaze. She's damaged goods. I'm just hauling her because the last owner wanted her gone. Damaged how? Webb shifted, suddenly uncomfortable. Two smaller planters from neighboring counties had drifted closer, listening. See for yourself. But I'm telling you now, nobody wants to work beside her. Curiosity, the same instinct that made Thaddeus track every number, sharpened in him. Show me. Webb strode over and grabbed the woman's chin, jerking her face upward. She didn't resist, but her whole body went rigid, like a hunted animal that recognizes the moment before the shot. When Webb pulled down the collar of her dress, the air seemed to change. Her skin, naturally a deep brown, was broken by irregular islands of pale white. They spread across her neck and upper chest, disappeared beneath the fabric, then reappeared on her forearms and hands. The borders were too sharp, the contrast too violent. It didn't look like scarring. It didn't look like bruising. It looked like someone had taken a human body and rewritten its surface by hand. One of the other planters made a faint sound of disgust and turned away. You see? Webb said, letting her collar fall. Abominable. He bought her at 12, didn't notice it till she got older and it spread. Kept her in the kitchen mostly. Folks say it's catching. I've never seen proof, but superstition doesn't care about proof. She causes fights, fear, trouble. I agreed to haul her west if he covered expenses, but I ain't representing her as merchandise. What's her name? Thaddeus asked, still staring. Sarah. No surname, I've heard. Reads a bit good enough to help in the kitchen. Can do figures some. In the back of his mind, something clicked. A memory of a medical text from his father's library. A condition that destroyed skin pigment in patches. Vitiligo. Not contagious. Not lethal. Not anything medically that justified the word abominable. But in a world where every rule was built on skin color and how cleanly it mapped to category and status, Sarah's body was an offense. A walking contradiction. How much for the three men in front? Thaddeus said quietly. And the woman? Webb stared at him. You serious? I don't make jokes about money. Augustus. Name a price for all four. The deal was done in 20 minutes. $800 for 3 strong field hands. $30 for Sarah, barely more than the cost of feeding her on the road. Webb looked almost relieved to see her added to the ledger, as if a curse had just been passed to another house. That night, by lamplight in his study, Thaddeus recorded the purchase in his careful hand. Acquired. Female. Approx. 23 years. Literate. Marked by skin condition offensive to others. No apparent impact on function. Assigned to kitchen house under supervision of deep pute cost. $30. Expected value. Uncertain. He closed the ledger without a second thought. To him, it was another calculated risk, an efficient decision. An oddity noted and filed away. He had no way of knowing that this one line would eventually demand its own sealed report, its own whispered legend, its own question that historians would argue over for generations. How did the woman the records called Abominable become mistress of Wikliffe Plantation? That answer would begin slowly and quietly. In the kitchen house behind the big white columns, where people like Thaddeus rarely bothered to look. Sarah's first weeks at Wikliffe Plantation unfolded quietly. Almost invisibly, the way a shadow begins to grow long before anyone notices the sun has moved. She was placed in the kitchen house behind the main residence, a hot, smoke-filled structure where 4 women labored from dawn until nightfall. They refused to sleep near her, refused to touch the things she handled, refused even to look at her for longer than a heartbeat. So Delapute, the free woman who ran the domestic staff, converted a tiny storage room into Sarah's quarters. A cramped 8x10 space with a straw mattress and a wooden crate that served as her entire world. Sarah accepted it without complaint, moving through her days with that rigid calmness that made even silence feel heavy around her. But Della was observant, sharper than most people realized, and it wasn't long before she began noticing details that troubled her. Sarah didn't simply read a little, as the trader had claimed. She read newspapers the way some people breathed effortlessly, completely, absorbing every figure, date, and political update without missing a single word. She reorganized the kitchen pantry, not by guesswork, but by a logical system of usage, cost, and season, something no enslaved worker should have known how to do. When Della tested her with arithmetic, Sarah solved unit conversions and supply estimates faster than Della could check them. It was as if her mind had been trained in a world she was never allowed to speak about, a world far beyond the cabins and cotton fields of Georgia. Della mentioned these abilities to Thaddeus during their weekly accounting, expecting irritation or suspicion. Instead, he asked to see Sarah's work. Her ledgers were immaculate, each page a map of precision. And when he questioned one calculation, she explained it with the calm, structured tone of someone who truly understood numbers, not someone who merely copied them. It was the first moment Thaddeus looked at her fully, not as an inconvenience, not as damaged goods, but as a mind. And something shifted inside him. He asked if she could read and write as well as she calculated. She met his eyes and said she could write letters that would not embarrass the person signing them. That single sentence, spoken without pride or fear, unsettled him more than her appearance ever had. Within minutes, he decided she would assist him in the study each afternoon, drafting correspondence, managing records, and helping with calculations he no longer had time to do alone. It was a decision he thought of as practical, efficient, even harmless, but nothing about it was harmless. When news spread that an abominable one would now work in the master's private study. Conversations stopped mid-sentence in the kitchen. Whispers traveled through the slave quarters, and brows tightened across neighboring plantations. Some feared her. Others despised her. A few simply felt that something unnatural was happening behind those white columns. But Sarah did what she had always done. She spoke little, revealed nothing, and watched everything. The afternoons in the study became a strange new world for her, one filled with books she had secretly dreamed of touching, maps she traced with her fingertips, ledgers whose order she could improve instantly, and a man whose careful mind seemed to recognize the shape of her own. They worked together for hours, their conversations shifting from crop yields to literature, from inventory shortages to unexpected discussions about law and philosophy. Neither of them said it aloud, but both understood that they were entering dangerous territory where a single misstep could ruin them both. By the time winter settled over Hancock County, Sarah had become something no one at Wikliffe had words for. Not a servant, not a clerk, not a curiosity, but a presence. Silent, intelligent, disruptive in ways no one yet understood. Wicklife's foundations had already begun to tremble, though no one, not even Sarah, could yet see how far those tremors would spread. The transformation that began in the study did not stay hidden for long. Nothing ever stayed hidden on a plantation, where walls were thin, windows were always watched, and even silence had a way of traveling. Within a few weeks, people began to notice changes in the rhythm of Wikliffe. Thaddeus spent less time in the fields and more time indoors, his evenings lit by lamplight long after the house had gone quiet. Sarah, who once moved only between the kitchen house and her small storage room quarters, now walked the short path to the main residence every afternoon, carrying ledgers pressed to her chest like a shield. The kitchen staff held their breath whenever she passed, unsure whether to fear her or pity her, or resent the fact that a woman with skin like broken porcelain was somehow stepping into a world that should have been locked to her forever. The enslaved men and women in the quarters whispered about how the master spoke to her, how he didn't shout or threaten, how he listened, truly listened, as if she were someone whose voice could shape the future of the plantation. Rumors grew heavier, more poisonous, twisting into stories that Sarah had bewitched him, that her pale patches were signs of dark magic, that she possessed secrets meant to corrupt the household from within. None of them understood that what drew Thaddeus was not her appearance, but the dangerous truth that she understood him, mirrored him, challenged him in a way no one else had dared in years. Their afternoon work sessions became longer as winter dragged on, the rain hammering the study windows while the fire snapped weakly against the cold. Sarah organized his library with quiet, deliberate curiosity, reading titles under her breath as though rediscovering pieces of a life she had been denied. Their conversations deepened first about cotton yields and supply shortages, then gradually drifting into literature, political debates, and even philosophy. Thaddeus began to realize that Sarah had read more than most white men he knew. She quoted Shakespeare with gentle accuracy, referenced constitutional arguments with unsettling clarity, and asked questions about economics that would have impressed any scholar. Her intelligence was no longer a secret he could keep to himself. He found his thoughts returning to her even when she wasn't in the room, replaying the way she tilted her head when she puzzled through a problem, or how her voice softened when she spoke of books she had glimpsed but never been allowed to fully study. It was not romance, not yet. It was something more dangerous, recognition, the kind that undermines hierarchies, dissolves boundaries, and forces a man to confront the hollow scaffolding supporting his life. But beyond Wikliffe, the world was already reacting. Plantation owners exchanged uneasy glances in the Sparta Mercantile, wondering why Thaddeus was suddenly withdrawing from society. Overseers whispered among themselves at a man who worked too closely with an enslaved. Woman risked losing not only his reputation, but his command. The most pointed warning came from Thaddeus's neighbor, Robert Crenshaw, who confronted him in the Sparta tavern over whiskey one frigid evening. He spoke of appearances, of propriety, of how a widower living alone could not afford to let a woman like Sarah into his private study without inviting malicious speculation. Thaddeus dismissed him with cold calmness, but the conversation lodged in his mind like a splinter. Even Sarah sensed the shift. She saw the way his jaw tightened when her name came up in conversations, the way he hesitated, not out of regret, but out of calculation, as he tried to anticipate every consequence of a world that was beginning to judge them both. Still, neither of them pulled back. If anything, their work became more intense, more intertwined, as though each suspected that something irreversible was approaching. And then, sometime between the quiet evenings and the whispered warnings, their dynamic crossed an invisible threshold neither had intended to approach. It happened not through touch or confession, but through moment in late May when Thaddeus threw aside a letter from his sister, urging him to remarry for the sake of inheritance and social duty. Sarah asked, softly but boldly, what he believed about marriage, about choice, about the roles people were forced into. Their conversation, dangerous, quiet, forbidden, slipped into a place neither could easily retreat from. When he asked whether she ever wondered who she might have become if her circumstances had been different, she answered with a truth so sharp it seemed to cut the air. Thinking about impossible things only makes the real circumstances harder to bear. But when he asked what might happen if circumstances could, change truly changed. Sarah's expression shifted into something he had never seen on her face before, fear, hope, and warning intertwined. She told him that anyone who crossed the boundaries of their society wasn't just risking their own destruction, They were risking the destruction of everyone around them. And still, neither of them ended the conversation. Neither walked away. As she left his study that night, closing the door softly behind her, both of them understood in perfect, terrible clarity that the rules governing Wikliffe Plantation had begun to fail. Something unspeakable had started between them, not romance. Not yet, but the beginning of a collapse that would echo through the entire state long before the rest of Georgia realized what had already shifted in the quiet, lamplit sanctuary of that study. The heat of the summer of 1850 arrived early that year, pressing itself against the walls of Wikliffe like a living thing, suffocating, relentless, and heavy with a sense of approaching calamity. The drought struck first weeks without rain, then months, until the land itself seemed to blister under the sun. Cotton leaves curled inward like dying insects, wells dropped dangerously low, and tempers frayed under the constant threat of crop failure. Thaddeus tried to manage it with the same disciplined precision he applied to everything, adjusting work schedules so field hands avoided the worst hours of sunlight, diverting creek water through hastily dug channels, rationing supplies with mathematical ruthlessness. But the stress carved itself into his face, hollowing his cheeks, deepening the shadows under his eyes, and sharpening his irritability toward anyone who executed his instructions imperfectly. Through all of it, Sarah's role subtly expanded. She took on more of the administrative burden, working in the study until the lamps burned low, reviewing accounts, drafting letters, reorganizing planting rotations, even attending strategy meetings with overseers where she stood silently at the back, absorbing everything. And though the overseers would never say it aloud, they relied on her observations because she noticed inefficiencies they missed, predicted shortages before numbers revealed them, and read people's patterns the way others read the sky before a storm. For the first time in her life, power moved toward her, cautiously, reluctantly, and with a bitterness that stung those who believed no enslaved woman should ever hold it. But the drought was only the beginning of the disaster that would crack Wikliffe open. In early September, the first worker collapsed in the East Field. Fever, violent, sudden, and unresponsive to the usual remedies. Within days, 3 more fell sick. Within 2 weeks, nearly 1/3 of Wicliffe's enslaved population showed symptoms: vomiting, delirium, uncontrollable shaking, skin burning with heat that refused to break. Panic spread faster than the sickness. Some whispered it was a curse brought by Sarah's arrival, a divine punishment for allowing her into the main house. Others said the drought had poisoned the water. A few believed the fever had been brought by spirits angered by broken social order. But to Thaddeus, none of it mattered. He turned the plantation upside down, converting a storage barn into an infirmary, bringing in a doctor from Sparta who tried quinine, purgatives, and bloodletting with inconsistent results. He himself carried water, changed bandages, and sat by the dying in the sweltering nights. And through all of it, Sarah was at his side. She did not sleep. She did not hesitate. She cataloged symptoms, tracked who responded to which treatments, organized nursing shifts, and waded into the worst of illness without fear. Her calmness, cold, steady, unnatural to some, became the only anchor in a world that felt like it was burning alive. Even those who once recoiled from her began to see her differently. When she saved their children, their husbands, their mothers, her skin patches no longer looked monstrous. They looked irrelevant. Then the fever struck Thaddeus. It hit him hard and without warning, reducing him to delirium within hours. His authority vanished instantly. Overseers panicked at the thought of a master's death without succession plans. Workers whispered prayers and feared the chaos that would follow. But Sarah stayed with him, refusing to leave his room, cooling his body through the worst of the night, forcing medicine between his teeth when he raved in confusion. On the 4th day, his fever finally broke, and when he opened his eyes, she was there exhausted, hollow-faced, sitting at his bedside like a guardian who had fought death itself and refused to let go. He thanked her, his voice barely a whisper, and she accepted the gratitude with the quiet blankness of someone who had not dared consider what losing him would have meant. But even as relief settled over the house, she told him there was something they needed to discuss, something that could no longer be avoided. She refused to tell him then, insisting he needed to regain his strength. It was a promise that felt like a shadow stretching across the room, a warning that whatever peace existed between them was ending. 2 weeks later, when Thaddeus could walk again, Sarah entered the study with a calmness that didn't match the tremor in her hands. And, with no preamble, she said the words that reshaped the entire future of Wikliffe. "I'm pregnant." Thaddeus felt the world tilt violently as every impossibility, every consequence, every social law carved into Georgia's foundations rose up like a wall ready to crush them both. She explained quietly, without emotion, that it had happened during his fever, when he mistook her for his late wife and she had failed to leave the room. She admitted she had wanted it to happen, that she had told herself lies about kindness and confusion, but the truth was far simpler. She had chosen it. In that moment, the entire social order of Wikliffe cracked open. An enslaved woman carrying the master's child was scandal enough. But this woman, this strange, brilliant, impossible woman, complicated everything. The law said any child born to her would be a slave, property, regardless of its father. The law said their blood could never be joined in legitimacy. The law said their lives must never intertwine in any way that threatened the boundaries of race, class, or ownership. But Sarah did not bring him this truth to ask forgiveness. She brought it because she already had a plan. One that could destroy them, one that might save them. One that would drag Wikliffe Plantation into a storm from which it could never return. The silence that followed. Sarah's announcement felt like a living thing thick, heavy, and suffocating, as if the entire study understood the gravity of what had been spoken inside it. Thaddeus stared at her, unable to reconcile the calmness in her voice with the hurricane tearing through his mind. Every law of Georgia, every rule of society, every unspoken boundary between master and enslaved, white and black, free and unfree, crashed together with terrifying clarity. A child born to Sarah would be legally enslaved, legally his property, legally a living symbol of a relationship that the entire South would consider an abomination. He tried to cling to legal solutions, manumission, secrecy, but Sarah dismantled each option with cold, cerebral precision. Freeing her would create scandal. Moving her would invite violence. Concealing the child would be impossible. Every attempted answer collapsed under the weight of reality, leaving only one path, one so shocking he wasn't sure he had heard correctly when she said it. Sarah proposed they marry. Not in Georgia, where such unions were criminal, but in the northern state where laws still recognized marriages across race. They would travel under the guise of business, marry legally in Pennsylvania, and return to Georgia as husband and wife under the constitutional protections the South preferred to forget existed. It was a plan that hovered between brilliance and suicide, a plan that no rational person could have invented unless they stood at the edge of survival with nowhere, left to step but forward. For a long moment, Thaddeus said nothing, staring at her, though he were seeing her for the first time, not just her face, her intelligence or the pale maps on her skin, but the astonishing truth of who she was. A woman born into a cage who somehow learned to study the lock, diagram the hinges, and calculate the weakest point in the metal. She was asking him not simply to break the rules, but to declare war on an entire worldview. And yet, in the quiet space between them, something inside him settled into place with frightening certainty. He would do it, not because he was brave, not because he was virtuous, but because the alternative remaining inside a system, he now saw with horrifying clarity, was a betrayal he could no longer stomach. He agreed. They would go to Pennsylvania. They would marry legally. They would return with the truth carved into the very paper that bound them. It would ruin his reputation, destroy his wealth, alienate every neighbor, and possibly cost them their lives. but it would save the child and somewhere inside him. That was the one fact that mattered more than every consequence combined. Their departure was staged with calculated normalcy. He claimed he was traveling north to inspect new agricultural machinery, taking Sarah with him to handle correspondence during the journey. A flimsy excuse, but believable enough to avoid suspicion. Della Pute, who saw more than she ever admitted, packed Sarah's few belongings in silence and wished her a safe journey with an expression that said she knew. This was a crossroads no one could return from unchanged. The road north stretched for nearly 2 weeks, marked by sleet-slicked roads, suspicious glances at inns, and the kind of solitude that wrapped around two people forced to share a secret big enough to crush them. And yet, in that long journey, something softened between them. Not romance, not the soft, naive kind, but a deeper acknowledgement, a dangerous acceptance that they were now bound together by choice, by fear, by necessity, and by a future neither truly understood. They married in a small Quaker meeting house outside Philadelphia, in a ceremony so simple it bordered on stark. No music, no celebration, no family, just a legal exchange of vows spoken, quietly under the watchful eyes of two witnesses who asked no questions and offered no judgment. Sarah wore a plain blue dress. Thaddeus wore his traveling coat. It was not beautiful, but it was binding, and that made it monumental. That night, for the first time, they shared a room not because of fever or chaos, but because the law now recognized them as husband and wife. It was awkward, tender, cautious to people trying to build something human in a world that insisted humanity between them was impossible. When they returned to Georgia, the land itself seemed to recoil. News of the marriage had arrived before they did. The plantation was eerily silent when their carriage rolled up the Oakline Drive, the air thick with dread. James Hawthorne, the senior overseer, met them with a face that looked carved from stone. He explained that Robert Crenshaw had already filed a legal challenge claiming Thaddeus had descended into moral corruption, rendering him unfit to manage land or people. Other landowners supported the claim. Officials had issued a warrant to examine Sarah for disease and mental abnormality. Someone had burned a cotton barn. Someone had poisoned feed. Someone had beaten one of the field hands as a warning. The plantation was unraveling under the weight of a marriage the community considered an affront to civilization itself. And yet, even in the face of sabotage, threat, and rising violence, neither Sarah nor Thaddeus stepped back. Because somewhere underneath the fear lay the same quiet truth. The storm had already begun long before their wedding. Wikliffe Plantation was no longer a place governed by the old rules. It had become a fault line one that would soon shake the entire county. The months that followed their return to Georgia unfolded like a siege, each day tightening around Wikliffe Plantation with the slow, merciless pressure of a noose. The legal challenge filed by Robert Crenshaw became the weapon everyone expected it to be dragging Thaddeus into courthouse hearings where judges frowned openly. Attorneys whispered with contempt, and petitioners arrived with prepared statements about moral depravity and racial contamination. Plantation wives whispered in church pews, turning their backs as Sarah entered, while men in Sparta sharpened their outrage into something more dangerous than gossip. Sabotage became a daily ritual. Fences cut overnight, tools stolen or destroyed, poisoned feed mixed into barrels, and anonymous threats left on the steps of the main house. The county physician's examination of Sarah, 3 humiliating hours of prodding, questioning, measuring the patches on her skin, ended with a report declaring she posed no medical risk, yet condemning her moral character and language designed to inflame in public hatred. Her pregnancy made her an even bigger target. People said she had entrapped Thaddeus, seduced him, bewitched him, corrupted him, anything except the truth that he had chosen her. Social exile followed quickly. Louisa Crenshaw led the other plantation wives in organized boycott, refusing to acknowledge Thaddeus, refusing to set foot near Wikliffe, refusing even to let their servants speak with its workers. Business slowed, creditors hesitated, and even honest transactions became suspect. simply because Sarah was involved. But amid the hostility, something unexpected began to gather around her, a small but growing circle of loyalty forged not by fear, but by memory. Some of the enslaved workers Sarah had nursed during a fever stepped forward to defend her quietly, subtly through action rather than speech. They worked harder, organized themselves without being asked, and refused to let sabotage succeed when they could prevent it. Delepute became her shield inside the house, intercepting hateful letters, managing incoming supplies with vigilancing any whisper of rebellion among the staff. Most surprising of all, Thaddeus's sister Margaret arrived unannounced from Savannah, demanding to see the woman her brother had destroyed his life to marry. She expected a manipulator, a temptress, a cunning strategist hiding behind pale patches and soft-spoken lies. What she found instead was a woman who met her gaze without flinching, who answered honestly, who accepted responsibility where appropriate but refused to pretend she was worth the sacrifices being made on her behalf. Margaret, who had come prepared to condemn, left the meeting shaken by the clarity of Sarah's intelligence and the unsettling reality that her brother's choice, however catastrophic, had been deliberate, reasoned, even principled. Still, none of it changed the fact that the legal hearing loomed like Judgment Day itself. The entire county waited for May 15th, whispering, arguing, predicting collapse. In the days leading up to the hearing, Thaddeus's lawyer warned him that while the law was technically on his side, the men interpreting that law were not. The only hope lay not in statutes, but in hearts cold, reluctant hearts that needed to be pushed into doubt. And so Thaddeus and Sarah made a decision no one expected. A decision that stunned the county and made the Sparta Gazette headline for a week. They invited the entire public to an open forum in the courthouse the day before the hearing. Anyone could attend. Anyone could question them. Anyone could witness their truth or their downfall. The courthouse filled to bursting. People packed the aisles, pressed against door frames, climbed onto windowsills, some seeking justice, some craving spectacle, some desperate for a reason to condemn. Thaddeus spoke first, outlining the legal legitimacy of their marriage under Pennsylvania law and the constitutional obligations Georgia preferred to ignore, but it was Sarah's speech that cracked the room open. With her pregnancy visible and her mottled skin illuminated by afternoon sunlight, she stood before hundreds of people who had never seen her as anything but rumor, and she spoke plainly about what it meant to be considered abominable, to live as something avoided, whispered about, hidden. She explained vitiligo, explained her abilities, explained how she had simply tried to live with dignity in a world that gave her none. And then she said the one thing no one expected, the thing that silenced even her harshest critics. I am not worth the destruction he has suffered. No one could be. He chose this path because the system that made me a slave was no longer tolerable to him. For a moment, the room wavered on the edge of something human until Robert Crenshaw erupted, accusing her of manipulation, witchcraft, moral decay. But the damage was already done. People had seen her, truly seen her. And once a thing is seen, it cannot be unseen. The next morning's hearing felt like a shadow of the storm that had already passed. Judge Matthews, irritated by the public spectacle, delivered a narrow ruling. The marriage, though personally repugnant to him, was valid under Pennsylvania law and therefore must be recognized. But the community, he added pointedly, was under no obligation to accept it socially or morally. It was a legal victory wrapped in the threat of ongoing hostility. But it was enough. Wikliffe remained theirs. The marriage stood. The child would be free. And as the couple walked out of the courthouse into the tense watching crowd, Sarah whispered to Thaddeus that surviving was not the same as being safe. But survival was the beginning of everything that would follow. Wikliffe had not fallen. But the ground beneath it had begun to change forever, and everyone watching could sense that the real storm was only now gathering strength. The months that followed the judge's reluctant ruling should have brought relief to Wikliffe. But instead they brought a tension so constant it felt like weather something you breathed. something you carried on your skin, something that soaked into your bones, whether you wanted it to or not. The marriage was legal, yes, but legality carried no shield against hatred. Every visitor who passed down the Oak Line Drive did so with the posture of someone approaching a cursed house. Every merchant in Sparta raised prices when Thaddeus entered. Every plantation wife tightened her grip on her children when Sarah passed by, as though broken pigment could leap from her skin and stain theirs. Yet inside Wicklife's boundaries, something remarkable, something deeply unsettling to the old order began to take shape. Thaddeus no longer viewed labor as property management. He viewed it as human negotiation. Workers who had once lived in rigid fear now found themselves invited quietly, carefully into discussions about duties, rotations, and even wages. It began with small changes: extra time for recovery after illness, increased rations during harvest, and the elimination of certain brutal punishments that had long been considered necessary to enforce discipline. But small changes ripple, and soon the entire plantation felt different. Its cadence altered by an unfamiliar mixture of trust, resistance, and growing possibility. Some workers pushed boundaries, testing whether kindness meant weakness. Others worked harder, trying to prove that dignity could coexist with productivity. Sarah moved through these shifting dynamics with the strange calm of someone who had long expected transformation. Even if she hadn't expected it to take this form, she managed every ledger, settled every dispute Hawthorne brought to her, made decisions about supplies and rotations with a clarity that made even the skeptics fall silent. And yet, despite her rising authority, she lived every day knowing that her presence alone could ignite violence at any moment. That violence finally surfaced in September. Daniel Tucker, the overseer who had always watched Sarah with a predator's caution, returned from a supply run in Sparta with whiskey on his breath and resentment in his voice. He stormed onto the east field, claiming insubordination, when Samuel questioned a reassignment. Tucker struck him hard enough to split his lip. When other workers moved to help him, Tucker drew his pistol, aiming it at 6 unarmed men while screaming that the plantation was descending into chaos because that woman had ruined everything discipline. Order, race, and even God's natural law. Hawthorne heard the commotion and summoned Thaddeus, who arrived with the anger of a man already accustomed to betrayal. The field fell silent as Thaddeus walked toward Tucker, speaking in a tone so controlled that it felt lethal. Tucker refused to lower the gun. Instead, he shifted aim first at the workers, then directly at Thaddeus, his hand shaking but his hatred steady. And then Sarah stepped forward. She should have stayed back. Everyone knew that. Even Thaddeus told her not to move. But something in her refused to let Tucker's words hang unanswered in the humid air. She walked beside Thaddeus, shoulders straight, voice calm, and said that recognizing people's humanity was not weakness, but Tucker's fear and hatred were. Her presence unbalanced Tucker more than any weapon could have. Rage twisted across his face as he screamed that she was a curse, a freak of nature, an abomination who should have died years ago. That moment, raw, venomous, unrestrained, finally stripped the truth bare. The fight wasn't about labor or orders or discipline. It was about a world cracking open because one enslaved woman refused to remain small, quiet, or invisible. Thaddeus fired him on the spot, not with shouting or threats, but with a finality that brooked no argument. Tucker's hand wavered, the pistol lowering as the consequences of killing a white man, no matter how corrupted, finally pierced his drunken rage. He left the plantation in a dark, trembling silence, vowing revenge, but too afraid to draw the final line he had approached. As soon as he disappeared beyond the tree line, the tension collapsed. Hawthorne tended to Samuel's injuries. The workers dispersed, shaken but alive, and Thaddeus turned to Sarah, who was trembling despite her steady voice minutes earlier. She admitted she was terrified, not of Tucker, not of the gun, but of what the moment revealed. That there were people in Hancock County who would kill them both not out of practicality, but out of principle. People who saw their marriage, their child, their decisions even their existence as a threat that could not be allowed to continue. Thaddeus told her that change would always provoke violence, that building a new world in the shadow of the old required a kind of endurance no one should ever be asked to possess, but which she, somehow, always did. They stood there in the heat of the fading day, watching the field settle back into uneasy rhythm, and both understood without speaking that Wikliffe was no longer just a plantation. It had become a battlefield, subtle, psychological, dangerous where each step forward required the defiance of an entire society. The years that followed Tucker's departure did not bring peace to Wikliffe, but they brought something far more dangerous and far more miraculous possibility. At first, the changes came slowly, almost cautiously, as though the plantation itself feared waking some ancient authority that had once governed every field, every cabin, every heartbeat. But gradually, because of necessity, because of pressure, because of the stubborn will of two people who refused to return to a world that had already rejected them, Wikliffe evolved into something no plantation in Georgia had ever been. Thaddeus began paying wages to workers, small amounts at first, then enough that some families saved toward purchasing their freedom. Punishments shifted from force to negotiation, from threats to agreements, from fear to a careful, fragile kind of respect. The neighbors watched all of this with horror, calling it chaos, corruption, madness, predicting collapse every season that Wikliffe failed to imitate the cruelty they considered essential to order. And yet, somehow, the plantation survived. Not effortlessly, not smoothly, but with a tenacity that made its enemies furious. Sarah became more than an assistant. She became the quiet architect of the estate's transformation. She managed every record, supervised every rotation, calculated every risk with the same cold precision she had once used to memorize newspapers in the kitchen house. Her presence in the study was no longer a scandal. It was the beating heart of Wickliffe survival. And though she faced hatred daily, though she carried the exhaustion of a woman constantly measured against rules she had never agreed to follow, she never faltered. She kept building. Their son, Thomas, was born into this unstable new world, a world teetering between old violence and new hope. His existence alone was a rebellion, free, legitimate, protected, and destined to force neighbors to choke on the contradiction of recognizing his father while refusing to recognize his mother. To their surprise, he grew up loved. Not loved by society. That would never happen. But loved by the workers who remembered. Sarah saving their lives during the fever. By Della, who watched over him like a hawk. And even by Margaret, who visited often enough to understand that her brother had not ruined his life but rewritten its purpose. The world beyond Wikliffe still hated them, still punished them, still whispered about witchcraft and miscegenation and the collapse of order. But within the boundaries of the estate, a different order took shape. A quiet, radical one. A world where decisions were made by minds, not skin. A world where a woman once sold for $30 could decide which crops to plant, which workers needed rest, which debts to negotiate, which futures were worth the risk. A world built on possibility instead of fear. But possibility has a cost, and the bill always comes due. Thaddeus died young, 46, worn down by battles he never stopped fighting, by legal wars, social isolation, and the immense strain of holding an entire county's hatred at bay. Pneumonia took him one cold winter, leaving Sarah with a will that he had crafted like a weapon, airtight, detailed, undeniable. It named her the sole heir of Wikliffe Plantation. It ordered continued wages for workers. It instructed that freedom be granted to any enslaved person who desired it. It secured Thomas's future with legal chains stronger than any social chain that had tried to bind them. The same judge who once threatened their existence was forced to honor the document. And so Sarah, born a slave, sold as an abomination, feared as a curse, became one of the few black women in the South to own, manage, and control a major agricultural property in the years before the Civil War. She ran Wikliffe for decades, not by imitating the cruelty she had endured, but by enforcing a new kind of order, one grounded in cooperation rather than domination, she outlived almost every person who ever claimed she was dangerous simply for existing. She lived to see slavery collapse, to see the Confederacy fall, to see a world struggle to rebuild itself around the truth she had understood long before anyone dared say it aloud. Humanity cannot be legislated away, Thomas inherited. Wycliffe in 1880, transforming it further into a place of learning and opportunity before eventually selling the land and using the profit to build a school in Philadelphia for black children, an institution that stood for generations. Sarah died in 1902 at the age of 75, surrounded not by slaves or overseers, but by grandchildren who saw her not as an abomination or anomaly, but as their grandmother, sharp, steady, and unforgettable. Her obituary did not mention the skin patches that once defined her existence. It called her a businesswoman, an educator, and a pioneer, and yet the truth of her story, the truth buried in ledgers, testimonies, sealed reports, and whispered accounts was far more powerful than any newspaper column could capture. The mystery of Wikliffe Plantation was never how an enslaved woman with vitiligo became its mistress. The real mystery was how a society built on dehumanization managed to ignore the simple, devastating truth she proved with her life, that the only true aberration was the system that once tried to deny her humanity. Everything else, her intelligence, her ambition, her courage, was perfectly, undeniably human.